want to acknowledge the many questions and comments that we receive from the in-class students as well as the external participants over time. So this is a very poor effort of trying to organize some of the comments, okay? So these are just first reactions. We barely scratched the surface, obviously, last week. We talked a little bit about the theories of change. We talked about development and what it is in general. We talk about like why is it important to define a goal in development and how the goal that you decide that is the most important thing that you're going to pursue defines the whole thing. What is it that you actually want to do and how far are you going to go? What is it that you're going to prioritize? And these are decisions that we have to make individually and collectively, like in development all the time. Like we're in the development. Okay? So I try to organize a little bit of the comments here, right? Like special things for people that stayed like very late at night and connected from different parts of the world. For example, Martin Odongo, in his comment about measuring epistemic power, right? Like particularly the reliance on Bretton Woods indicators over lived realities. And here we're going to get into this conversation, for example, about GDP or not GDP, or how is it also that indicators condition a lot of what we're saying. I was thinking about Martin Odongo yesterday because actually the UN Secretary General had a long interview just over the weekend precisely on this topic, right? Like in how actually measurements limit us in the way that we do and pursue the goals of development over time. We'll talk and we'll see, for example, how the UN over the years has been leading the discussion about alternative measurements for development outcomes, for development goals. You have issues, or like we have comments like Elana Wong's on legitimacy, neutrality, and power, right? Like particularly looking at the neutrality, challenging the concept of neutrality of multilateral action and the neocolonial conditions in aid, right? ODA, official development assistance. We have comments, for example, on economic growth versus lived well-being. Here we have Martin, Sobeida, and Elana, right? Talking again about skepticism towards GDP as a proxy for success in places like Uganda and Peru. They actually provided some specific examples, and I'm very thankful for you for doing that. More into like theory of change, Ana, Martin, and Urada, right? Like they have been talking a little bit more about like using theory of change as a hypothesis for how social interventions unfold. Yes, and we're going to see them in action today. I have more people, at least I want to show them the names, so let me just move this, all right? And what we are going to do is like every week, we're not going to do like a big review of all the questions, of course, because I expect also that over time, you, external participants, and you, in-person for credit participants, you are going to have more questions and more comments, so you're going to make it much harder for me to talk about all of them. And that's fine, that's a problem that I want. Please send your comments and questions. But we're going to start with some sort of like summary map that is always going to be shared about where the temperature of the room is, how people are actually feeling about like the things that we're talking about. What is your first reaction sometimes, which may be different to the one when you review the PowerPoint at a later point, right? Like when you have live and you put in the chat box than what you may think the next day, okay? So issues like agency, autonomy, social justice came out, right? And systemic and forward-looking questions. Here I wanna I also noticed the questions that both Lauren and Nick sent around structural adjustment programs and UN coordination. We'll touch them as an in-focus analysis today, a little bit. Expectations, aligning for everybody, especially those of you that are connecting for the first time, all right? It's impossible. It's going to be impossible to go in a level of depth that I wish I could give you, okay? That is a fact. We're going to have to make some compromises in terms of like the content and how far we can go in certain topics. Ask questions, all right? I'm going to have to prioritize the in worst case scenario every week, as you saw that we did last week. You will receive not only the PDF or PowerPoint with all the slides, but you will receive a separate document with all the references that were used on justifying that particular PDF or PowerPoint, all right? So you can always dig a little bit deeper when, as a business. You can dig a bit deeper in Now I have it in my head. All right, into the particular topics. All right, and if you have questions or you want to discuss some, I mean, like I have office hours on Fridays. All right, so office hours, just send me a message that you want to have 30 minutes, 20 minutes with me just chatting about the course, about the topics. You got it. All right, typically I keep open my Zoom in the morning on Fridays to do that. All right, when I'm working on something else. So if you have a nurse on Friday morning Eastern time saying like, I really need to ask Mario something, like send a message. We may actually have a chance to talk. All right? Good. Next, what do we have? PIM. All right. So if you remember, every one of you that connects as external participant, all right, last week I left homework. So basically, I was proposing people like, think about the difference between microlending and microfinance. Do a bit of a research on the terms. And then let's try to build a very basic theory of change based on the concepts and the way that we approached it last week. All right? So why is it that we did this? Because microfinance is a very good example of a type of intervention that has evolved over time. Has evolved over time as a response to both evidence, but also context, politics, power struggles, debt, as we will see. So, if microfinance very much grounded on very strong concepts related to, like, basically poor people being entrepreneurs in waiting, all right? Where we move from just having access to money for a business or whatever it is that you deem important and a priority for you, right? Into a whole ecosystem, more of an strategy, right? And I'm dropping that word for a reason too, based on our conversation last week. So if I had to summarize, and it's very hard to summarize in the end, right? Like, what is the arc of this evolution in microfinance, right? Like something that has existed or has been widely discussed since the 1970s, all right? We can divide it in three segments or three stages. The linear promise, all right? And linear on purpose I'm mentioning based on what we discussed last week. With the basic thesis that poverty is basically a market failure, right? Like a model that is parsimonious, scalable credit, and the key social collateral. How is it that we are able to make poor people subject of debt? All right. Then you have in the 2000s what is called, what we can call the reckoning, right? Oh, evidence versus reality. In the end, the data was starting to tell us that there was a relatively modest impact. Okay? And the shock, basically, of over-indebtedness. Very quick story here, right? Like, and Yusuf, you may actually confirm this when you tell us a little bit about Bangladesh in a moment. But I had the opportunity, like, to go and advise this very small NGO in southern India, okay, in Tamil Nadu. We were like 2 hours, 3 hours deep from Madurai, basically, where I was staying in a hotel in the highway. And it was an amazing and interesting experience, but also very much eye-opening, right? Because everything that you think that you know about microfinance, especially that being young, like everything that you have studied, the early impact evaluations around it, etc., right? Like, have to face the reality of over-competition, for example, like 3 different NGOs working on microfinance in the same village. Or, for example, right, like the problems of caste and how caste affects, right, like the possibility not only of reaching the poorest of the poor with this kind of intervention, but also limiting the type of business that they can actually open. So how is it that these very clear realities for people that live there, right, like, were not taken into consideration when the model was introduced? And what is it that happened with microfinance over time? You had issues of a lot of people getting in debt, right? Others being able to repay, but actually by taking all the credit at higher interest rates, right? And some people even kill themselves. Right? And over time, what we can discuss as a third stage is this systemic resilience, right? Like this synthesis that goes more into the heart of what is called now financial inclusion, right? A model that emphasizes ecosystems and systems. Okay? So, what if we take that initial iteration, that initial perspective on microfinance, and we turn it into a theory of change, right? So this is something very basic, right? And you guys here in class have already been working a little bit on this. And you may have come with different things in these boxes, okay? But we started in microfinance as a movement that emphasized inputs as small loans in group-based lending, right? That was at the core, and it's still at the core of microfinance. So then, based on that, the activities that an NGO, for example, or a state-sponsored program will actually focus on are issues like peer monitoring, joint liability, repayment mechanisms. The key to show that this works is not, in the end, or not necessarily that people get out of poverty, interestingly enough, but the key activities, right, like, were about repaying. Because for this to make sense, right, there needs to be shared responsibility, hence the group-based lending. And the point in the end is that if there is repayment, then the program can continue, because then that money can go to somebody else in the group. Look at the outputs and the kind of things. You look at the literature in the beginnings of microfinance, and you will look actually at high repayment rates and credit access as key features. And then outcomes like microprice activity, consumption smoothing. Impact, sustainable exit from poverty, and poverty. Okay? But the linear assumption here that I was talking about is this logic, this sequence, right? Because if you get credit, of course you're going to invest in business. Of course you're going to generate income, or at least your chances of generating income are much higher, right? And then with that income, you're generating empowerment. You have more income, you have more options, right? Right? Maybe. Okay, so every theory of change has assumptions. Some of them are very clear, and the person or organization implementing the program is going to make them very explicit. But many are not there. Most of the times, go to any theory of change that you may see of any program, all right? Here's the big exercise that you need to do. Like, are the assumptions that they declare the core ones for that program to work? Most of the times, the answer is no. Doesn't mean that whoever built a theory of change planned it that way or wanted to hide it. But the assumptions that you state are going to reflect what is the worldview that you have about the problem and about how to solve it. So if the solution is just spark capitalism in the poor, right? So the way that you're going to look at the needed assumptions for the program to work is different than if what you're looking at is, for example, right, like this idea of empowerment, incentives, and so on. All right? So these are just 6 common assumptions behind a typical microfinance program, okay? Especially in the early days. Okay, you can go and review these slides later. Okay, remember, Leah, if there are questions from anybody or there are comments, just let me know. I mean, I can point out to some of them. Okay, and we can read them also later. But remember, even if we don't respond to your comments, you external participants, what we're gonna do is like, we're gonna synthesize them, right? And we're gonna try to respond them in the following session, right? Or throughout the course, and we'll make a note of that. We value all your comments, and this is not one of those telephones that we value your time. All right. So this is how microfinance also as an alternative, as a type of program, gained popularity over time, right? And went from like this early diffusion, particularly in South Asia, then it was tested in South America. Peru was like a big experiment ground for microfinance over the years. Lots of research, lots of impact evaluations, right? Because it's the kind of program that lends itself for doing impact evaluation, right? Like you can test a counterfactual. We're gonna give a larger loan to this group of people and a smaller loan to other people, right? Like, let's see how that demand is gonna change over time. We're gonna prioritize business, women-led businesses, right? Like, or are we testing empowerment in the household? Who's making the decisions now? Over time, there's so much of like, so many like variations that it happened. I myself had the opportunity to participate on an impact evaluation of a microfinance program in Pakistan. And also, eye-opener. I can tell you that over a year later. I'm sorry. Water. So just think about it. Institutionalization, metric of success. Okay. So this is how basically how it started as an experiment and then it became standard. To the fact that we were talking about how one of the people moving like that was the big initiator, if you want, or the image of microfinance programs, right? Yunus, currently the president in Bangladesh, right? Like in the end, he gained the Nobel Peace Prize, not the economics prize. So. Here's it. Sometimes data takes time also, but the data speaks for themselves. So there were tons of RCTs, there were some effects here and there, right? Like, but in general, right? Especially if you like look at Banerjee et al., for example, right? Like that, definitely microcredit ended up helping smoothing consumption, right? But rarely generated that transformative income that was promised. So this part is very important. Like that level of heterogeneity, that difference in the outcomes in the end, right? It was very much context dependent. So again, I bring the case of the Dalit in small rural communities in Tamil Nadu, right? So like you face that particular social context, right? And the results that you may expect from a microfinance program are very different. But it was not only the evidence. At the same time, things were happening. I was in India doing this field work in 2007. 2007, so 20 years. Wow. So the Andhra Pradesh crisis was still very fresh. And there were cases being reported all across, in particular India at the time, challenges for microfinance. So what ended up happening is that over time, between the evidence and the response to the programs themselves, many times just many places microfinance initiative had to close simply, right? Maybe what you had is that that people use the money for crops, and then you had a typhoon season that was horrible between 2005 2007, and regularly this happens, and people still had to repay the loan, but now they couldn't because they don't have the food, the crops that they were going to sell in the market. So what do? Okay. This. Okay. Then what we end up is with a different way of looking at the theory of change. This didn't happen because one person saw the light and just like, let's just think about microfinance differently. It was a whole process of trial and error of responding to the evidence, but also responding to the political considerations, right? Like in the crisis related to microfinance in many places, in particular in India. Okay, so then what was more of a linear thinking approach to a theory of change in microfinance turned into a more nuanced standard theory of change. Now, this is just an attempt to represent the way that we tend to look at microfinance nowadays, right? Doesn't mean that if there's going to be a microfinance program, everybody represents the theory of change like that. No, not at all. But look at the type of inputs, for example. First of all, before that, right, like the goal is a bit different. When microfinance started was in the 70s. The goal was reducing poverty. Okay? Reducing poverty. The average, or not the average, but the normal goal that you see in terms of a narrative for microfinance programs nowadays is more about resilience. So resilience as a or social protection in such a way that you are able to withstand shocks or weights or changes in the environment. Look at the narrative of more modern, if you want, recent microfinance program and compare it to the narrative behind the ones in the old times, right? 70s, 80s, 90s, and even early 2000s. And you will notice this kind of differences. So, does it mean that we solve the problem and microfinance is perfect now? No, of course not. There are still persistent challenges, right? And new frontiers to be explored in terms of microfinance. Particularly, the next stage in something that is very much discussed nowadays is merging, integration with other programs and strategies, particularly issues like social protection. So, wait, if microfinance is now about resilience, protection, making sure that people don't fall back on poverty, for example, or their situation gets worse, but also, right, like if you are able to just get out of poverty through this, fantastic, let's do it. So then, what's the difference between microfinance and cash transfers, for example, or social protection? So we're not going to talk about them, right, here, but I wanted to suggest, right, like that you make these kind of parallels more of like a regular thing. Try to think about what are other types of programs or initiatives, right, that try to do something similar. So think about this slide, for example, when you are looking both at climate initiatives, but also attempts to rethink or redefine democracy, which are going to be the two big topics for the work, the collective work that we're going to do here. Okay? So, just leaving you with a thinking here. The point is that it is possible, sometimes painful, to evolve in the way that we approach a problem. First of all, we may use a tool to solve one particular type of problem, and then we realize that the definition should change. And that is important, because as we learned last time, the goal that we define is going to mark us. If our goal is growth, we're going to prioritize growth, regardless if we believe or not that it's important what happens with that growth and what are the effects for the economy or what type of growth it is. If we put the center on people, it's different than if we put the center in the national economy. And nowhere is going to become more obvious than when we talk a little bit about the history of the government. So first of all, I want to give an opportunity to Yusuf, and I hope that everybody listens or is able to hear. You will tell me, Leah, if you can hear what Yusuf is going to share. Yusuf is on the phone right now from Bangladesh. And if not, that's okay. I'm only going to ask Yusuf if you can be very to the point in this case, particularly considering audio issues. But I'm very thankful that you decided to participate and share an experience with us.
Yes, Professor, thanks a lot. I have also posted my comment here in chat box.
Oh, fantastic. Super, and I can share it with everybody after. But anything that you wanted, what is the key point that you would like to make?
The first key point is, Professor, I would like to refer one of the computable general equilibrium-based PECI study conducted by Professor Selim Raihan back in 2017 on to understand the impact of microfinance on the GDP of Bangladesh. The paper argued that the overall impact of microfinance on the GDP of Bangladesh was 11.2%, but in rural areas it was more higher, almost 12%. But when we look at more granular level, the study found that approximately 26% of borrowers actually fell in debt trap, and they had to borrow from other MFIs, pay another loan. So that was kind of a vicious cycles of microfinance. And another issue is that some other study also found, conducted at micro level, that 40% of borrowers actually were struggling to pay their loan. So if I compare this situation with the experience of Peru, we know that the microfinance started there in 1970, much before than Bangladesh. So the Peru experience is big different because Peru regularly actually conducted some evaluation program, assessment, and they institutionalized it more. So the what differences are in regional basis. Bangladesh failed to actually contextualize it and to create an enabling environment. For example, in a system where microfinance worked or tried to resolve the poverty problem, didn't favor the outcome of microfinance. So if we only give money, is definitely without any condition, we are giving money, but other factors in the system, for example, inflation, for example, access to other healthcare services. If I look back to Omar Toshan's capability approach theory, if they don't have functioning capacity, actually it doesn't work. So this is exactly this thing happened in Bangladesh. In many cases, those who actually fell in debt trap. So this is the experience from Bangladesh, Professor. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that in such a concise way. If you don't mind, share on an email to me or on the box, right? Like the story that you are saying, fantastic, and the paper, so I can share it with everybody.
I have already actually shared my comment in chat box. I am sharing the paper as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Yusuf. Appreciate it. Thank you, guys. I hope that you heard him, but otherwise, it will be in the recording. Don't worry. Right, and we'll put all the information. Okay, I want to dedicate a few moments just to talk about the Miro board now. So hopefully you found this example of a theory of change for a widely spread and known program useful. We're going to continue to look at theories of change during the day-to-day, but more in a historical context. So hopefully you will find useful that. But before that, I want to make a break here, right? Sort of a commercial of what is to come, all right? So what is going to happen is that we're going to share after this class with everybody, in-person participants and external participants, all right? A link and a password to a Miro board. Okay, so for you people connecting online, right, like the students are going to lead a Miro board conversation and research on two core topics. One is rethinking democracy, right? Rethinking democracy as focused particularly on agency. And don't worry if these terms seem a bit like strange for you, we'll talk about them. You may also be quite seasoned in development. And this is where you enter, especially people that have already experience in development. We need you for this exercise. It's not going to be only the students. The same way that we will have a group on rethinking democracy, we will have another one, the mighty group on influencing climate action and energy transition. All right, they are going to be leading the consolidation of feedback, not only from their research but also from you during the semester. So this is not just a class, in case it wasn't obvious already, right? This is going to be an exercise on collaboration to build the future of development. We're going to first have a segment in which we're going to be doing it on two topics, democracy and climate, as we were saying. And we're going to explain why is it that we pick democracy and climate in particular. But over time, what we're going to be doing is that we're going to be asking questions every week to everybody. And we're going to be asking feedback from you, external participants, people connecting us from everywhere in the world, even if you are live or that you connect at some point on the week with the material. This is your opportunity to contribute. We're going to ask questions about your own program and initiative, or programs, initiatives that you know of that have been, in your eyes, successful, right, in redefining or helping build or strengthen democracy, right, or in influencing climate action at a national level or at the international level. Also, we want you to share your struggles, programs, initiatives that you see that have failed or that are stuck, right, and what is it that you think is that about? Or if you don't know, tell us. We want to introduce that into our conversation. And what is going to happen is that by the end of the semester, we're going to have a draft document with experiences and suggestions from the entire class, from everybody that has signed up for this class. Every single comment or suggestion is going to be attributed. You're going to be co-authors of the section where you decide to participate. And this will be published at the end of the year after a series of validation co-creation workshops that will take place during the summer in the Philippines, in Zambia, Zimbabwe, and in Morocco. Okay? And if you are watching us and you are interested in co-organizing another co-creation workshop of this kind in your country during the rest of the year, please let us know. We will be very interested in doing that. Then, by the end of the year, we will release this shared publication. So, this is the basic map of the logic of what we're trying to do here. How do we move from like this discussion about the international development space being in crisis to a process of collaboration and co-creation, right, on two major topics, right, and proposing concrete things looking at the future. And also, the things that we consider being open questions, but that are important to address. Because we will not have all the solutions. If it was that easy, somebody would have already found it, and will probably make a lot of money, like we did. So, I mean, like, we're going to try it. We're going to do our best. And I think that it's going to be a fantastic opportunity to practice collaboration. We all talk about collaboration. Well, this is an opportunity to do it. How do we individually and as a group can contribute to solving some of the most difficult problems in our time? So, in this ecosystem, you are part of it, the Explorers Network, which is basically the network that we started at the Governance Action Hub, right? That you have been invited as participant of this class to be part of. And where one of the key things that we're going to be doing over time is that based on the interest and the expertise that everybody has, we're going to match you over time to the opportunity to contribute to conversations around specific problems. This goes, by the way, beyond the class. If any student here is interested in doing that, so we can match you to conversations, for example, about climate in Zimbabwe, right, with people in the network over there, we will be very happy to do it. And you will receive information specifically at that, and you will have access to an online space for collaboration. The platform itself, right, like we're gonna test and we're gonna use a middleware for this. But over time, what this is gonna happen is like it's gonna migrate into an online platform, the one that I was talking about. And the UMD students, basically this is an exercise where all the research that you're gonna do around this class, right, is gonna be directly turned into concrete contributions. And you're gonna have an opportunity to interact with many of the external online participants during the semester. Okay? All right, hopefully that sounded interesting, challenging, crazy enough for you to log in again next week, or well, in 2 weeks, I expect. Okay? So you can look at the resources and you're gonna see what we have in terms of like phases, right? And how is it that we're gonna go through this in the class. We're gonna be talking about diagnosing the international development space, what is the international development system, what are the challenges out there. Then we're gonna be talking about how is it that we can build strategies, how is it that we can move beyond simple theories of change to have a mindset on building strategies to solve important, interesting, complex problems. And then the big exercise around collective intelligence, that is, in the end, how do we synthesize this in a way that is practical, right? So we're going to learn all about this during this semester in class. With you two external participants, if you decide to join us, hopefully you will do so. And again, we do not have the expectation that you will be here for 14 sessions. We know that not everybody is going to be able to be here or to be able to catch up with 14 sessions. But when you decide to contribute, you can go back to any of the material, catch up with some of the things that have been discussed, or simply receive the questions and collaborate, contribute in the middle with your perspective, your ideas, your suggestions. Talk to us about your program. Right? Okay, so class questions so far, being about the middleboard or being about theory of change and microfinance. I know, you're overwhelmed. It's lost. Let me rephrase this. Like something that you didn't know about microfinance and now you know. Somebody else that didn't share that before you open it up.
Mario, as you're getting into this, we do have a question from one of our online participants.
Do you want to bring that person in? Maybe they want to ask their question themselves?
Sure. 1 second.
Please, welcome and introduce yourself and tell us where are you calling us from?
Looks like I don't see him in the chat anymore. I'm wondering if he disconnected or if he got disconnected. I know his, or their connection was not very stable.
Can you share the name?
So, yep, I can, it's from Chris Loboshi. And he basically, or they were writing to ask about the difference between microphone financial and financial association. That's what they've typed out. If they're able to rejoin, I'll let them know and can ask them to unmute then. But if you want to take,
that's fantastic.
if you want to respond to that, and then we can follow up.
For those kind of questions that are so specific, what we'll do is like when we send the references, right? Like we'll send the reference to these categories. Because within financial inclusion, in general, in the term, there are many things out there that are connected directly or indirectly to microfinance programs, right? Like in this case, it's more about like the way in which that particular group or set of groups organize themselves in a given community or in a geographical area. Okay? Any other question for now? Online? No? Anybody here? Please. Tell me your name again because I'm still familiarizing the names and the faces.
Tosin.
Sosin?
Tosin.
Oh, Tosin. Yes. Welcome.
Thank you. So, I have a question. One major thing that I have observed in our class, both today and last week, is about that in development, there is need for friction for change to take place. We saw last week and today. Drawing from the lessons from microfinance, you reiterated that based on the development changes that are occurring, that if the shift goes from single growth to complex resilience, that the theory of change must also evolve. So and now I was just thinking that in situations where there is a group of development experts,
Yeah.
and one thing about group work is people always have a very big perspective.
Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons why group projects are very difficult to get to do. Yes.
Yeah.
So because like you were mentioning earlier, like doing my group projects, I used to be like that since when I got to the US that I learned how to work with people because of very projects and overall looking at where I'm going, I know how to work with people. Here's my question. So when you have multiple opinions amongst the group workers and it's so tense, how do you eventually handle it that everyone comes to a consensus of what to do without getting angry at each other? And how do you achieve it? Because once there is no cooperation in the group, it's very documented.
Absolutely.
So how do you do that? And based on your own line of work over time, what are the strategies that you have employed as an international development expert?
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. I'm probably sure that the people online have not necessarily caught up. Maybe one way that we can do is like bring some sort of like microphone that I can put over here, and that will make it easier. I mean, like, we'll work on that. But the question that Tonsing was raising is about the friction. This concept that we discussed last week. So this is an example of like how a particular approach to development, right, reflected in one particular type of initiative or program has evolved over time. It sounds clean, clinical, oh fantastic, we reacted to the information, yay, right? But it's not that easy. Number one, as I mentioned before, right, like it's not just that the evidence showed this or that, it's about lives that were lost or ruined also in the process. In that learning process was not costless. It's very important that we recognize first that. But second, which, and tell me if I'm understanding well what you're saying too, it's like that process of change is not immediate. Because think about it. If you have invested your time, you have done your hiding strategy, let's say as an NGO or of a state-sponsored program focused on microfinance, right? And everything that you are doing is focused specifically on the micro-lending part, the microcredit part of microfinance. Because that's the way that our central office in Washington or in Nairobi or wherever it is has told us that we have to do. That the literature is telling us that this is the way to go. That we have very strong assumptions based on rational choice and capitalism, all right? Because this is the way to go. How do you disinvest when you realize that you have to change the way that you approach it? Who are going to be the first movers? Who are the ones that are going to apply this? The risk is too high. I already made all these investments over the next 3, 4, 5 years. And also, at an individual level, most people do not like to admit when they're wrong. Me included, I don't like it. Right? So think about this, right? Connecting to this example that I gave in Tamil Nadu. I mentioned that in one of the villages that I had to visit, where we have this particular problem, right, which was with the program, that the program clearly was not getting to the poorest of the poor, or when you had people of a valid origin, right, like they were limited in terms of the businesses that they could open. There were 3 microfinance organizations working in the same village. This is not a large village. Okay? Who do you think that was one of those 3 that actually realized or like was pushing for change, and particularly was raising the narrative around the dialogue? The answer is the local, least funded one. For two reasons. You may say, like, it could be one of these two reasons, maybe two reasons combined. Number one, right, like, the owner of that NGO was from the area, the guy that founded it. And he based all his strategy in trying to convince donors that there was a whole segment of the population that was not being served. He got very basic initial funding from GIZ, I'm pretty sure, at the time. Now it's GIZ, the Germans. Okay? But he was actually running out of funds, and he was trying to convince them to give them additional resources. That was the situation in which he was. At the same time, he's the guy that has less to lose. If you compare to the other two very well, I'm not going to give the names, but I don't even remember the names. Right, like the two other very well established organizations, nation or international wide established at the time, right? They had a way to proceed. And they were not going to change it immediately. And they just have to show the numbers. I'm exaggerating, of course, right? Like in that sense. I don't read their minds. But I thought that it was symptomatic, right? That the most local one, the one that had a presence specifically in that area and knew more the context, at least in their narrative, they introduced this more aggressively. So there is friction because nobody wants to be the first mover in changing. Unless, and that's what happened after Andhra Pradesh, when this becomes too public, where the scandal is too risky for the organization, sometimes you are forced to change. It shouldn't get to that point. But it is true that change is difficult. It comes with friction. But friction is also what gives us the opportunity for change. Hopefully without loss of lives. Okay. Any other question about microfinance before I move to a fantastic section? First of all, think about the history of development also in terms of like a theory of change. Why is it? Because we're going to organize a bit our thinking here. First of all, trying to understand how this evolution in the theory, in different theories of development, right, is also centered around the discussion of what is the goal. And one key thing that we're going to see, right, like is how this goal has changed or mutated over time. All right? Somebody was talking about GDP growth, for example, or growth, economic growth, and it's an important variable, of course, right? Like, but we're going to see other goals in development, like the reduction of poverty, or the reduction of inequality, or the lack of less dependency, right? Like, and so on. So, how do we organize what we argue is the right course of action? Is all articulated and organized in the end based on the goal. Because if the goal is economic growth, that is going to define what the outcomes that we would like to see in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years are, right? What are the outputs pursued, the activities that we use, and in the end, the inputs, which include the money. Who's going to pay about it? So, okay? So, Newton, I know it may be scary, but here's the thing. Think about it. You come from different disciplines, all right? Maybe, and I don't know, at some point you thought about studying psychology. Maybe at some point you thought about studying law, or maybe economics, or sociology, or anthropology. And I told you about my story in Peru and how proud I am about my school, right? Like this interaction in particular. The thing is that both social sciences, right, in the end, they are social sciences, but they have very strong roots, first of all, in Cartesian science, but also in Newtonian science. So if you actually think about it, the reason why we call them social sciences is just because they are an application of many of the things that we learn from Descartes and Newton in particular. So why is it that we talk about laws in social science? Why is it that we talk about deterministic behavior? Why is it that we talk about mechanics? Like this particular activity will generate this output, which will generate this outcome, which will take us to this goal. That mindset, that way of organizing things, comes actually from science. Comes from Cartesian science, and it comes from Newtonian science. Very much influential. Now, what is different between science and social sciences, aside of the subject, of course? Any reaction or suggestion? Hint. Science has moved on. If you actually think about the history of science, right, like from Descartes, which was instrumental in a response of to the whole world that was before him, right, to Newton and the laws and gravity and action and reaction and all those, to the theory of relativity, right, and Einstein, and eventually to quantum theory nowadays. Each one of those steps didn't happen from one day to another. It was a whole evolution where every time that you were bringing a new paradigm, a new way to look at science, right, you actually had to debunk and you had to fight with the establishment, what people believed before. Think about the old story, I don't even know if it is true or not, right, about Galileo, like basically just trying to avoid being killed and just saying, well, yeah, the earth doesn't move. And then he gets out and like, and yet it moves, right? Like, so this point is that change, that defying the establishment, the status quo, it comes at a price and it's not easy to achieve. But in science, you have something very interesting that social science militant doesn't have. What is? Well, let's start with the scientific method, right? So this whole discussion around, well, let's observe, let's test, let's see if it can be repeated, not only by me, but also by my peers, right? Like, how is it that you get feedback? These established feedback loops allow people for over time, even if there may be resistance, and let me tell you, there was resistance, okay, to move from one paradigm to another. This is important because typically when we associate lack of bias, right, or like the absence of bias, or like less bias, is typically in a discussion about science and scientists. Even though scientists can be biased, by the way, as people, right? They may have their own beliefs. Think about Einstein, right? Like not being open to quantum theory, basically out of his own religiosity, right? Like God doesn't play with dice, right? So these kind of like assertions. So he may have the evidence, but you are still very much tied to something very fundamental. In his case was faith, right? Like in other cases, maybe politics, right? And you decide not to go that route. So that is something that we do not have enough in social sciences. Even today, I want you to understand, because you will not understand modernization and Rostow otherwise, right? Is that these people were not just crazy people that were just fixated with colonizing people, other people, and just imposing their ideas, right? Maybe they did a little bit. I don't know, I didn't know them personally. But they were convinced on what they were proposing because it responded to the way that they have learned to understand the social world at their own time. And regardless if we believe it or understand it or not, we have received that legacy. That legacy is still very much present. One book that I'm going to recommend to you, right, like it will be in the references, is one by Alexander Wendt. Alexander Wendt in 2004 wrote this awesome book, right, basically on political economy. But one of the things that he was precisely arguing, right, like is how in social sciences we need a jump equivalent to the one from Newtonian science to to quantum size. And we're going to see a little bit of why is it that we're making that comparison right here, right? If you think, in this case, Newtonian, we're saying Newtonian because Newtonian already captured a lot of the Cartesian signs, right? Like going from materialism, reductionism, determinisms, A causes B, right? To particular mechanisms, right? To a word and an understanding of dynamics in a society, right? Like that are actually more reflexive and based on feedback loops. Political, meaning purpose-driven, because in the end, people have their own purposes, their own culture, their own priorities, their own points of view, and the way not only that they see the world, but the people around them, the people that they trust, see the world. Any similitude to current events is not a coincidence. And then, which after looking at this actually should be obvious, right, is the idea of non-linearity. Non-linearity. Why is non-linearity so important? Because in the end, if you have a new way of thinking that is very well to a problem that people have been approached in one particular way, right, you may have the evidence. You may even have the resources. You may have the proof that you have the truth. But that doesn't mean that the other person that is used to the old way is just going to change for you. Even if you show them the evidence. Because not only you have your own beliefs, but also if you accept that you were wrong, who's helping you save face? How do you justify your career? Or the fact that you deny like going in one particular way or another. Think about microfinance. It was not about the evidence. We would love to actually think that it is about the evidence that the programs were not that impactful. What triggered things and generated an urgency of change is what you were seeing on the ground. People being shamed. People losing everything in a typhoon. Suicides, etc., etc., etc. So, with that perspective, let's look at the post-World War II a little bit. Okay? So, you have to think that, first of all, when the different countries after World War II, or before, right before World War II ended, in 1944, I believe, they meet at Bretton Woods, all right? And they, as a consequence, form what later we'll call like World Bank and IMF, right? The two major first institutions of the multilateral development system, all right? You have to think that in that moment, they were inspired actually by Keynes. Keynes is considered the father, in a way, of the institutions from Bretton Woods. What is Keynes most well known for in economics?
I don't know, could be maybe the Keynesian cross.
Like the Keynesian cross, like what? What is the Keynesian cross?
Right. Learning it right now, actually.
That's okay, keep going, keep going. Anybody else? What do you know Keynes for?
Like the theory that in times of crisis, the government can increase spending to like spur the economy forward.
Yeah. So it's like that is a theory of counter-cyclical policy, right?
Yeah.
So it's like when you're growing, save, right? When you're falling, invest and spend, right? And the government is well positioned to do that. So typically we link Keynes with the idea of government intervention that is necessary. Now, clearly it's not because he was crazy or because he was unilluminated. Why is it that he was so into that? Because it worked. Because it worked, right, after the Depression, right? Like, think about 1929 and the 30s, right? And then, as the US is recovering on one side, hell is ensuing in Europe, and the war starts, right? So, what are we going to do? When you start thinking, oh, Europe eventually is going to need to reconstruct, so what is the model that we're going to use? what is the most like significant recent event that has marked us, and where basically government expenditure that is counter-cyclical, right, like help us get out of the hole. Well, Keynesian economics. So Keynes was instrumental in the foundation, in the funding of the World Bank and the IMF. Now with different goals. The IMF was set up for stability. The World Bank was focused on reconstruction. One was focused on prevent competitive devaluation. Why? Because in times of crisis, particularly in the 30s, what you had, especially among countries in Europe, was basically a competition, like a downward cycle, a vicious cycle of using exchange rates and trade just to try an advantage of short term with their neighbors. And what they were trying to prevent when they met, and it actually made sense, is like you need some level of stability there. So the IMF was focused precisely on that, in preventing competitive devaluation in particular, but also informing trade policies that will actually help stabilize economies. While the World Bank was focused on capital infrastructure. You need money to actually overcome this. And they were pumped because their first task was to reconstruct Europe, right? The Marshall Plan. And guess what? It worked. In parallel, 1 year later, the Charter of the UN was set. Right? This was 50 countries, first, maybe somebody can correct me on that. But the United Nations focus was different, was on cooperation, was actually on keeping peace. Cooperation for a one goal in particular. How do we avoid falling again into this mess that we just got out of? That was the original goal of the UN. It was more of a political forum. Okay? The logic behind was this. Very reasonable, right? Sometimes we criticize a lot the World Bank, the IMF, the UN, right? But this idea is very hard to actually argue against. Peace is achieved through economic interdependence. Okay? I'm not saying that it's right, that works every time, all right? But it's harder to actually fight with other. It's harder, not impossible, right? Like if that other, the economy, our economies depend one from the other. That just happened. Okay? So, what happened? You fulfill your first mission, the Marshall Plan. But then the focus started to go to other regions of the world. And that's where things got a little shaky. Also because as the Marshall Plan were coming to an end, or it was rendering the results, the expected results, to say the least, what you had is that the Cold War era was settling. So then you have not only the technical considerations, right, of development, but also the geopolitical ones. So then this idea of having people on my side, right, and because otherwise they can go to the other side, became more and more predominant. But there's one more thing. Things are dynamic. These institutions, particularly IMF and the World Bank, were very much influenced in the beginning by the Keynesian paradigm. But at the same time, it was gaining traction, right? Like a whole movement of trying to explain, right, how is it that a country modernization theory. Modernization theory found its time also around after the World War II, because also you needed a consistent, strong narrative to counter communism. So that made it more prominent, more popular among politicians too, right? And scholars like Rostow, who in the end will produce this paper called an anti-communist manifesto, right? Like on the different stages of growth, right? Came about. It's the first time in this story that I mentioned growth. Please.
I have a question just about the sentence on the bottom of the slide. Sorry. So development was invented as a byproduct of security architecture designed to stabilize the global north. Is that more of like an argument in retrospect that they were focused on the global north, or do you think that they also thought that? Like, because I think
Who's
it's
them?
the people developing it, the, you know,
Not everybody,
Yeah.
if that is your question. And I mean, like, that sentence may be too much of a generalization. It is true. But I like to put it out there still, right? Like, because to understand what are the big ideological currents that went behind giving shape to this. So again, if development in the beginning was about modernization, right? The only model that you have is the model of industrial revolution. The countries that were considered a model or successful, right, like had gone through some particular pace or like journey in that sense. So, like, how is it that in an environment in which we need to convince others to be like us, because otherwise they may go with our enemy, right? Like, turn this into a tool, right? Like that can be used. So, we now talk about development and we think about, we consider like the whole argument around agency, for example, right? Or people-centered development. But in the moment, it was about countries, right? It was about the numbers. Yeah. And this modernization theory came about, or like was better structured, if you want, like as a narrative of different stages of growth. So this we can call the era of the engineers, like modernization and structuralism. So I'm mentioning these two ideas or theories of development because they went almost parallel, right? But again, like modernization had the logic that we were discussing a moment ago, and structuralism, particularly Breivik and others, right, like was very much a response to this, right? But look at the core things or that are mentioned in each one of those, right? Like on one hand, right, the idea is that is this whole sense that you have the core and the periphery. And you have these countries that are focused or based on manufacturing, and you have the poor countries that are focused on what they produce is raw material in the system. So if the goal or the big problem that a counter theory like structuralism identified was dependency in the end, because this turned over time into dependency theory. So the solution, right, is to end that dependency. How do I change that dependency? By focusing on import substitution. So how is it that I produce as much as I can so I don't depend from manufacture from other countries? How do I force myself to manufacture anything, right? So Peru, instead of like exporting only coffee, right, like we should be exporting cars, right? We should make it. And if we cannot do it alone, we'll get in groups, right? Hence the Andean Community of Nations, right? Also over time, that came later. And let's just get together and we just trade among each other. Okay? But look at the assumption here. The global trade structure is the track. State planning is the scale. In modernization, right, like you have this theory of history. This is destiny. And what you can do is like you can go through all these different stages of growth, right, like of modernization, like, and you can actually make jumps. You don't have to wait 100 years, right? Like it is possible. There is a way. Very much similar actually to what happened in the way that the writings by Marx, for example, were treated, right? Like, so Marx talks about a history, a destiny, right? And then what you have is that in the application of that, what people were trying to do is just to cut stages, right? How is it that we get faster to the end of times? But in both work under the assumption that the state was key to making this change happen. Right? So typically you may think that modernization, growth, no, it's all about liberalism and private sector and all. No, These early models, 50s, 60s, were very dependent on the intervention of the state. Without the state, you cannot make this happen. Okay? So we go to the 70s. And in the 70s, particularly, you have a reformulation of structuralism, right, like called dependency. Right? And what you have is that the basic needs approach that typically is identified with the ILO, the International Labour Organization, right, where like there is a problem, growth is happening, but poverty remains. So then what we need to enhance is direct service provision. While in dependency, for example, underdevelopment is produced by the rich world, and then what we need to define as a goal is the link. Why is it that I'm emphasizing this? You can go to any book into Google and get a better history about these different development theories. What I want you to get out of this conversation is not about the whole story of each one, right? It's how each one was focused on a different goal. And how by focusing on a different goal, you build the tools of development so we can, as a collective, as a country, achieve those goals. So far, you haven't heard poverty and inequality. You have heard growth, you have heard modernization, you have heard dependency, you have heard lack of services. Okay? So, how is it that we move from this that was happening in the 70s, right, to then the market correction of the 80s and 90s? So this is the stage where we typically associate with neoliberalism, right, Reaganomics, etc. But it actually started in the 70s. And it starts because something big happened in the United States, actually, during the government of Carter. Lauren, can you tell us what happened during the government of Carter that changed things in global economics?
The oil crisis hit, we were really unprepared for it.
Yes, we were.
The US hit a period of stagflation, where inflation was rising like rapidly and job growth was just kind of, it wasn't even necessarily decreasing dramatically, but just kind of like staying stagnant to the point where like everything was getting worse and nothing was correcting itself on its own.
Yeah. So what did the US have to do?
Increase interest rates and essentially cause a recession so we could recover from it.
So the whole system, right, of the early days, right, of the global economy, the multilateral system, and the possibility of having all these rules for trade, right, and discussing about exchange rates, etc., was because this commitment from the strongest economy in the world, right, like to actually peg to the price of gold. And that changed, right, like completely changed that changed the whole panorama, right? Like the stability of that war in the 70s was broken. All right. So what was percolating there at the same time is this going back to the idea that the state was actually the solution, and rather that the state was the problem.
Hey, Mario.
So again, Reaganomics and Reagan didn't happen because Reagan woke up one day and say, oh, okay, this is what I'm going to propose. This came and this happened over the years. You need actually to build a whole economic argument, government plan also before the elections. You have to promise it. And it proved that this change in the discourse was very popular also because of like the challenges that the states have been going through around the world. I haven't even mentioned issues like corruption. Nobody spoke on those years really about corruption. It was talking about is the problem, it's too big, it spends too much, it's inefficient, right, etc., etc. The discussion in corruption, for example, it became more explicit only in the 90s. And part of the proof is that actually, like the first time that you have the mention of governance in World Bank lingo was in 94 or 95. But before then, it was just something very ideological. It was just state, bad, private, good, market's good. All the same thing. Okay?
Mario, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, please.
Thanks. I've taken over the slides and the sharing because it seems like your classroom is disconnected somehow.
Oh,
I've been trying to follow along quietly, but I can't always see the screen clearly. So if you could just announce next every time you move to another slide, I'll be able to follow you better.
fantastic. Thank you, Leah. And I'm sorry. All right. Next, Leah. The human turn, 1990s to the present. Okay? Again, this is not a history class. It's just to show you how the goals in development have been changing over time and how that defines our whole toolkit. How is it that we pursue development is going to be defined, but what do we mean is the goal of development? That's why we care, right? This is not rhetoric. So here it is that, for example, the effort and the focus from the UN in particular to try to find different metrics to understand their own mission and redefine it in another way to what many other organizations probably with more capital were actually doing, right? Like this shift from a mentality just focused on the GDP and considering looking at the Human Development Index, right, came in. So here it is that in this environment in the 90s, we have, for example, Development as Freedom by Amartya Sen. This idea of capabilities, of agency, right, is something, again, that it didn't occur to Amartya Sen just because. It's the result of a number of conversations that have been evolved, particularly from the 70s, from the times of ILO working on basic needs, for example. So how this thinking in the international arena, mainly led by different UN agencies, right, like turned with the help, of course, of philosophers and thinkers, economists like Amartya Sen and so, shape it into a consistent, a solid proposition focused on the person. And this was a big shift. It's no longer only about the economy, the country, right? It's about the people. It's not about just reducing poverty as a number. It's about agency. And that does change. It does change the needle. It does move the needle. All right. Okay? You can go back to your slide deck and look a little bit about this. Okay? How different theories have different dominant goals, which means that they have core mechanisms. And what are the basic hidden assumptions? Remember when we saw the hidden assumptions for microfinance earlier in the class? Okay, this is the equivalent for development theories. Okay? I'm going to pass this very quick. Why this matters? Okay? I'm not going to go slide by slide because you don't need it. You can go back and read the slides and you're going to have the list of references. But the point that I'm trying to make here, again, is not just to show off, oh my God, how much I know about the history of development, right? Like, I'm sure that any historian is going to say, like, hey, you're crazy. It's just that I'm actually focusing here in the discussion of different goals. And guess what? Those goals, those shifting goals over time, gave us this, the essential toolkit of the development practitioner. Technical assistance, policy-based lending, we didn't start with that, but it's a traditional one. Concessional loans, project grants. If you look at the things that most multilateral banks, World Bank, IDB, other regional banks do, for example, right? Like, you're going to see a lot of these, right, as tools. These are your traditional tools that also are the reflection of all those ideologies or all those approaches to development over time. Because if what matters is growth and you generate growth through capital investment, right, like, then you need cash, right, to build bridges, to build dams, to like build roads and so on. So then to do that, you typically use concessional loans. Concessional loans is like either that you are paying a very low interest on it, lower than market interest, or that you have one percentage of that loan that is a grant. So let's say of a total amount of money, 25, 50% is a grant, so you don't have to pay it back, but you have to pay back the other half at low interest rate, right? And of course, grants, which are direct transfers. Question for you, is this 8? Is this what you consider or identify typically as 8?
Yes.
Yes, typically you consider it 8, but actually not necessarily. Okay? So, before we move to that, right, let's just do it. What has been happening is that over time, because we have different goals in development, we have something more focused on agency, right? A lot of focus on poverty. We have focus on sustainable development goals, like thinking about the climate, for example, and so on. What is happening is that over time, that all these different instruments occur. So, for example, you criticize that governments don't do the work, so instead of giving them money up front, you only give them the money when they show results. Hence, results-based financing. Blended finance, for example, when you actually want to lower risk for being the private sector, the one putting money into a program, instead of just depending on the government of the United States to actually, through USAID, oops, that doesn't exist anymore, right, to actually pass money to a government that may or not actually use properly the resources, right? And other different admitting adaptive programs, okay? Now, what is 8? Okay, 8 is one particular subset of all these instruments. Basically, not what is it? Not all 8 is all development instruments, or 8 are development instruments, right? But not all development instruments are 8. I guess that helps. So this subset of 8, right, is really this ODA, this official development assistance. Okay? So aside of that, you may have many other mechanisms, right? Or you may have grants that are not necessarily 8. Typically, when you measure 8, it's either from a government to a government, or from a government to a multilateral. Okay? That is ODA. Okay? But there are many other tools out there outside of what we consider 8. Some of them are more focused, for example, on people, direct private transfers of funds, facilitating remittances, foreign direct investment, trade policies, non-concessional loans, etc. Sorry that I'm running here, but I don't have much time, and I still want to share something here. We typically talk about humanitarian aid or development aid. Sometimes we speak about them interchangeably, but there is a difference. There is a difference in terms of the urgency, right? Like short term and all, right? Like, and in particular. But development aid, typically, it focuses on structural change, while humanitarian aid shows in the short term trying to overcome or help countries or communities overcome a particular emergency. You need a humanitarian aid also because if development is based also around the conditions for investments or the conditions for agency, right? Like you need institutions. And in an emergency, institution building makes absolutely no sense. Most of the time. Think in terms of better. So when you think about the future of aid, right, you may have heard about this in other classes too. Like, aid is dead. Like with USAID gone and everybody investing in security around the world, basically development is gone. We saw the numbers last week. We saw the numbers. It's a crash. It's a tragedy for the whole sector and for the people that that sector was meant to serve, with all the problems of the sector in the world. Okay? But here's the thing. Over time, we're seeing new alternatives in development to aid that do not necessarily depend on bilateral aid, right, or ODA, those traditional aid instruments, but also are more and more ingrained, regardless if they come from economics, trade, laws, etc., right, like into the development patterns. So now when we talk about the future of aid, we start talking about these different groups of tools. We have an expanded toolkit. Part of that was because of the emergency of aid, the crisis of aid over time. Because guess what? Before USAID, budgets were still shrinking. Before USAID, like the predictability of how much money a country or a community or an NGO was going to have to be able to continue or building programs for people, right, was not necessarily there. It was not predictable. People, as the thinking about development has evolved over the decades, has also responded with new tools. They are imperfect also. They are not necessarily going to solve the problem, but they are the reflection of a shifting in the understanding of what the goal of development should be. And they do not have to be the only ones. We see, particularly in the discussion around climate, now and more, climate group, you may actually have to research about this at some point, right? Like new and creative ways in which, for example, regional development banks, the Asian Development Bank with the IDB, start trading debt among them. Just that financial mechanism generates a spread in terms of money available that can be invested, for example, on climate initiatives. It's a financial creation, right? I'm very bad, I know the basics of it. Right? Maybe I should know more about it. But this is something that has been experimented between multilaterals only in the last 5 years. This didn't exist before. And it's in part due to a change in the paradigm, in the way that we think about development, but also in terms of like the priorities and urgencies of the system. The climate architecture for climate change based on commitments from the COPs and all is not working. It's not working. We can have 30 more COPs. And I know that I'm being unfair. Some people will say that have been to the COP or have been fighting for change at the COP for climate change. Like we say that I'm wrong maybe, right? I'm sure that there has been progress, right? But in the aggregate, what you keep saying and having is that people show up to many of these conferences or ready to lobby against much or like significant progress. So that tells you something about the mechanism. But there are people that from their own trenches are trying things that may be different, that may work or may not work. But guess what? That's exactly what we're here for, to experiment and to explore. What is it that we can do different from your own point of view and from the experience that you bring? In the example of this mechanism of swapping debts between multilaterals, right? Like that was applied from a different problem, but brought into the development in climate finance and financing in particular. It's going to solve climate change? No. But it gives additional cash to people that are fighting. Next. Sorry, Leah, I should have said next. Where are you right now? Beyond 8, the 5 families of future tools? If you are, that's one behind now. I'm going to move to the current state and an easy compromise. And the point here, I mean, like I'm closing right now, but I have many more slides that I'm going to give for you to read, right? Like that respond to some of the questions that were brought for this class, right? Like, is that in the end, if we accept that we humans are complex, that we are not just driven to what we usually call rational choice, that we are not necessarily just an homo economicus, all right? then we need to think, right, like that we are embedded in systems that are complex, non-linear, and they are also political. And that calls for a different set, a different generation of tools. That's the message I want to leave with you. Maybe you will not think on the next tool, right? But there are people actually thinking about what is the next tool? What do we do about this problem? How do we overcome this problem? I hope to be able to work with some of them, right, like in this class in the year. Part of my job is trying to find those people and try to connect them. Okay? So that's the message I wanted to give you. Now, a few notes. Okay? First of all, I'm giving you a few slides here because we have a very good question by Nick on terms of like, well, what happens with the UN? The UN doesn't coordinate well. There's a lot of ways, maybe, etc. I'm not saying that that was the implication of the question, but like there is a lot of criticism about the UN. So I actually prepared a small deck that I'm going to go back to when we have a class about cooperation. Because what this is trying to share with you is like why cooperation between agencies that seem to have the same objectives, right? People very good, right? People that want to do good in the world, and yet cooperation is so hard. And it doesn't mean that they don't try. Okay? So that is one thing. So take a look at the infographic, right, in a few slides with some references that I want to leave you here, all right? And of course, if you want to discuss a bit more about this, we can actually talk more about this when we have the class on cooperation. Same for all the participants online, all right? Please look at the material, ask questions, react, make notes. I disagree with this. Where did you get this from? I actually learned this in a different way. Maybe you are somebody that has worked or works in the UN, in a UN agency. Tell me. Maybe we can actually bring you in, we can have an interview, right? Like, and you can share a bit your experience if you are willing to do so, okay? But part of it is that in the end, coordination is not a technical problem, right? It's a problem of incentives, yes, but incentives will be the easy answer, actually, the classic economics answer. It's also about the governance, and it's also about financing, also, the problem, and the incentives that the financing generates in the end. Okay, you can look a bit more about this, but I guess that a good message for this will be, this is, for example, an effort in 2018 to try to reform the system so there's better coordination at the country level. But even this, like giving more power to the resident coordinator, the RC, right, like left with a bunch of different problems. This is the response to the pandemic, where you have declining resources and aggressive competition for survival, then coordination space shrinks. Okay? Again, we're going to go back to cooperation, coordination in the future. Okay? But I'll leave you with this because this is something I want to come back to eventually. Right? Like, how is it that we can improve coordination between agencies in the multilateral system? Maybe let's start by acknowledging that it seems to succeed better when you have that kind of scenario. How is it that we will apply it to a different problem outside the UN, for example? And I'm leaving you also with a set of slides here, all right? Focus on structural adjustment programs. Thank you very much, Laura. All right. So this is not necessarily going to show and solve the problem, right? But this is, again, in an environment or thinking in terms of a theory of change, right? You have a very well used, known, demonized sometimes, and glorified sometimes, depending who you ask, tool, structural adjustment programs, very much used, especially in the 80s, right, and the 90s too, all right? And the impression is that either they work or didn't work, right? So what I try in the examples here to show, Lauren, is that to bring a bit of nuance, particularly in cases in Africa, right? Because the general impression is like, structural adjustment didn't work in Africa and it worked in Latin America. That's not true. That's not exact. It didn't work that well in Latin America and it was that fatal in a few countries in Africa. So it depends. And sort of the information goes at what is it that they rated well with, that is in green, okay? what is so-so, and what is red, what didn't work. Okay? Something to consider. Hopefully this is helpful, all right? But my point with this thing is that even that, right, like you can turn it into a discussion of theory of change. Why is it that structural adjustment was so popular? Again, if you compare structural adjustment to the timeline that we have for development theories and the history of development, of course this was a preferred tool. If this happened in the 80s, and the state is bad and the market is good, simplify, okay? So the tool that you're gonna prefer is a structural adjustment because in the end, it allows the macroeconomic stability that leads to private investment, and that private investment can lead to economic growth. And then, because, you know, the rising tide raises all boats, eventually, through trickle-down economics, people's life will be better. There is a story there, but the focus of the story is not the people. The focus of the story, the final goal, is private investment, because that was seen as the core engine that will make everything else happen. There is a story. We talk about storytelling. Storytelling is not in effect, is not something gracious, and no, it's so important. It's so important. Whoever controls the narrative controls the game. Alright? So, I'm going to leave you with this. You can explore. There's some references to Peru, to Africa, to different countries in Africa. The case of Zambia is very important because it's considered that things were really bad, for example. But you can compare it to Tanzania, for example, where you actually have like a halfway a structural adjustment for different reasons. Okay? So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much. I know it's a lot of information, but hopefully those simple messages have resonated. Thank you so much to everybody that joined us online today. Hopefully it was helpful. Send questions, comments. If you disagree, please let me know. All right? We are going to send an assignment and questions for everybody to share their stories, share about their programs, initiatives that they would like to highlight and to consider us in the board for that collective communication. Thank you so much. And there's no class next week. We'll send a message about that online.